"What the hell was that thing?" said Jackson, puking. He slumped against George. "I don't feel so good." George helped Jackson to his feet and saw that they were still alone. Good. The fact that they were still by themselves meant that thanks to the sounds from the movie and the whoops of the band, no one had heard anything. There was still time to save Jackson and time to keep a secret. But not much. Jackson's eyes were dilated, his tongue lolled in his mouth. "Do you want to live?" asked George. Jackson jerked his head, but George couldn't tell whether the man was nodding or shaking it. "Jackson, listen to me. You want to live, don't you?" Jackson was beyond answering, so George answered for him. He dragged him into the bunkhouse through the back door and lay him down on his cot. He got a knife, a candle, and a bottle of whiskey, and then took a brief furtive look out the front door. The men were still mesmerized, not giving a damn that two of their comrades were gone. George pulled back from the door, avoiding even the slightest glance at the screen. That would be too much, even now. White zombie be damned. George lit the candle and held the blade of his knife over the flame. He poured the whiskey, first on the heated knife, then down Jackson's throat. The man hardly had the power to swallow and barely even had the power to choke. George crushed one corner of the bedsheet and jammed it into Jackson's mouth. George held the knife against the base of Jackson's thumb, which by then was almost black, oozing a foul pus. He held the knife an inch below the bite marks, pressing it against the part of the flesh where the skin was already turning from pink to gray. "There's no other way," said George. "I wish there was, but there ain't." He took a deep breath and sliced as cleanly as he knew how, while Jackson howled through the cloth, which thankfully dampened the sound of it, and then fainted. George poured another slug of whiskey onto the wound and then wrapped the hand tightly with scraps from a shirt that had been abandoned by one of the men who had vanished. Having just encountered the undead cur, he was now pretty certain where they'd gone. He'd answered Jackson's question when he woke, tell him exactly what that was all about. He swore he would, because though he may have decided he'd just have to get used to being one of the loneliest guys in the world, something which he never thought he'd have to be, there was no way out of this life alone. Tonight proved that. I'm going to skip ahead now. By now, most of you may recognize the world in which this is set. He manages to save Jackson and realizes he can't run anymore and has to go back to where this part of his life began, to that little part of land where George had to put Lenny out of his misery. Along the way, they meet a few other animals. They meet Curly's wife, who they have to deal with. But skipping over that so we make sure to fit in all of the story. As George led Jackson back to where his final chapter had begun, the journey made him feel as if they were traveling not just in space but in time. If only that were possible. If only he could have done it all with different choices instead of what was coming. But that was wishful thinking, and he had no more wishes left. He did not follow a path which would lead them there directly, because he did not want them to meet head-on the one who followed, but rather forced this to be ended where it seemed right that it should be ended. So they circled back around the far side of the valley, made their way as far up the foothills of the Galaban Mountains as they had energy to spare. George wanted no possibility that they would meet at some random midpoint. Rather, he wanted to draw his friend back to that place in the brush by the sandy banks of the Salinas River. Lenny would remember that place, even with all that had occurred, even with what he had become. George had made sure to drum that hiding place into his feeble brain until it stuck like tar. If all else was burned away, that would remain. George was sure of that. It took them several days to reach the spot and several further encounters with pets that Lenny, when living, had not been able to help but kill, and by the time they'd arrived, night had already fallen. George could barely see the outlines of the place, but in his bones, he knew. This was where his friend had been reborn. "What do we do now?" asked Jackson. "We wait," said George. "It shouldn't be long now until he returns, until it's over." He knelt, ran his fingers through the soil on the patch of ground where his friend had fallen. "I don't know that I'll be able to sleep," he continued, "but I have to at least try. Why don't you take the first watch?" George threw himself down under a sycamore tree and closed his eyes, but even though he was exhausted, his eyelids had twitched with fatigue, sleep would not come. Somehow, by unconscious thought, he must have sensed that he should be aware of that stretch of final moments before he did what he had to do and not pass through them unconscious. He looked at the branches above him and then closed his eyes to think about his next step, and when he opened them, he found that he must have fallen asleep anyway, for Lenny was there, crouched beside him. George quickly glanced over to where Jackson was supposed to be keeping watch. The fool was slumped over, having fallen asleep instead of preparing to do to Lenny what they'd done to Curly's wife. He cursed, not at Jackson, but at himself. It was too much to have asked of him after he'd already undergone so much. George looked back at Lenny, who sat there as if frozen. He could have been a statue in the moonlight rather than a man, a dead man, but still a man. George could make out a wound at the base of his throat, the bullet hole not where he would have imagined it to be. He hadn't been able to look before, but now he knew for certain he must have pointed the gun down at the last instant, missing the brain completely. It had been enough to kill him, it just wasn't enough to keep him killed. They sat there unmoving, and in George's mind it was almost like the old days. A night that, like any other in a long string of nights, and he was being asked to tell him like he'd done before. Asked this time not with words, but with silence. And he knew that he would answer that request as he always had. Guys like us are the loneliest guys in the world, said George in a whisper, not because that's what he intended, but because that's all that would come out at first. They got no family, nothing to look ahead to, but not us. No, not us, because I got you to look after me, and you got me to look after you. George looked over at Jackson, his sleep unbroken by the bizarre conversation occurring so close beside him. George raised his voice, hoping to rouse the man. We're going to get the jack together and get a little place, he continued. We're going to live off the fat of the land. That's when Lenny would normally have punctuated the speech by clapping his hands together. George hesitated, leaving a space for the old familiar answer. He waited, looked for any movement, however imperceptible, from his old friend, but none came. We'll have chickens and a vegetable patch and rabbits. Rabbits, Lenny, rabbits! George was shouting now, but no matter how loud the words came, Jackson wouldn't move. He could see then in the moonlight that the man wasn't sleeping at all. Arrayed around them were dozens of end-dead mice in various stages of decomposition, and all the other animals Lenny had in his clumsiness put down. Every watchful eye was aglow. The puppy they encountered earlier sat curled in Jackson's laps, its intestines draped over the man's legs like ribbons. His neck was bent and broken, and what George had earlier taken to be a shadow from the brim of the hat pulled low over his eyes had actually once been a waterfall of blood, a waterfall now stilled. George looked back at Lenny to see a matching patch of color smeared across his face. George said slowly, I guess I'm not going to get to tell you about the rabbits no more, am I? He said. Lenny answered by also getting to his feet. Once he started rising, he kept on rising. George tilted his head back to look him in the face the way he had for years. He was surprised that even though it hadn't been that long, he'd already forgotten how amazingly tall Lenny had been. His friend stepped closer, but George did not retreat. There would have been no point. And besides, all was as it should be. He made a promise to Lenny's Aunt Claire, a promise to watch over him, to make sure no harm came to her adult nephew. He failed. Failed them all. Failed Lenny and Clara and Candy and Crooks, who'd hoped to join George and Lenny in that dream none of them ever would live to see. And now Jackson. And himself. Most of all, himself. He made endless promises, and he failed to deliver on any of them. And whatever happened next in the remaining moments of his short, hard-scrabble life, he deserved it. Everybody in the whole damn world was scared of each other. But George wasn't scared no more. Not even when Lenny's teeth ripped through his stomach to what lay beneath. George had always told Lenny that someday his friend would be living off the fat of the land. As his life seeped from him, as he began to lose consciousness, he managed in his last moments to be strangely comforted by the sudden awareness that even though the alfalfa and the chickens and the rabbits would now be forever out of reach, even though he fulfilled no other promise on this earth, he'd at least fulfilled that one.